So our last video introduced the idea of an ethical pluralism that is founded on the idea of prima facie duties. In this video, we're going to dive into that kind of theory in more detail. So in this video, we'll briefly review what ethical pluralism is. We'll talk about prima facie duties. What are they? Ross's lists of prima facie duties. And then we'll talk about how these prima facie duties relate to the morally right action and our sort of final duties. And then we'll consider some examples to illustrate the theory. So ethical pluralism, remember, is the idea that there's more than one fundamental moral principle. And ethical pluralism can come in two forms. The first says that the moral rules at the foundation of morality are absolute. The second says that the moral rules at the foundation are non-absolute. There are exceptions to them. The problem for the absolute version is that, well, what happens when these different fundamental absolute moral rules conflict with one another? It seems inevitable that these rules would give conflicting advice in different situations. But if they're absolute, if it's always wrong to break them, the theory seems to lead into contradiction where the one and the same action is both right because it follows one rule and wrong because it breaks another. Now, the non-absolutist version avoids this problem because even though the moral rules or considerations at the foundation of morality might conflict with one another, there's no contradiction because these are not absolute moral rules. They allow for exceptions. And so it's sometimes morally acceptable to break these rules. And so in the case where they conflict, you're going to have to break one of them. Now, the non-absolute version of pluralism appeals to fundamental moral rules that W.D. Ross, one of the first defenders of this kind of view, calls prima facie duties. So let's break this sort of term down. A moral duty is something we are morally obligated or required to do. Prima facie is just a Latin term that means at first view. So putting these together, you might think a prima facie duty is something that we're morally required to do at first view or on initial appearances. Now, while I think this is a helpful way to sort of get an initial idea of what a prima facie duty is, it is also misleading in two ways. First, this talk of something being our duty on first view or on initial appearances makes these sound as if they are subjective, as if somehow they depend upon how they appear to us or they depend upon our own sort of perception of this sort of action. But that's not true. Ross's view is that prima facie duties are objective moral considerations. So it's not your belief or your perception or your desires or your preferences. You have these obligations regardless of what you believe or how things appear to you. Secondly, prima facie duties are not actually duties. So a duty, as I said, is something you're morally obligated or required to do. But notice, oftentimes you have these prima facie duties, they exist and they apply to you, yet you're still not required to comply with that duty. And that's because they're not absolute. They're not decisive. So a prima facie duty, then, a better way to define it is as an excellent, non-absolute, permanent reason to do or refrain from doing something. So I like this way of thinking about prima facie duties not as a duty, but as a permanent moral reason. Now, Ross suggests that we have a prima facie duty to keep our promises. Let's assume he's right about that. And let's just see, what would that actually mean? Well, first, it would mean that there is always a moral reason to keep your promises. This is the sense in which prima facie duties are permanent. No matter the situation, the fact that you made a promise to someone is a moral reason to do that thing. But in some situations, there's more than just one reason, and sometimes these reasons are pushing us back and forth. There's reasons to do something, but also reasons not to do something. And to say that it's a prima facie duty means that the fact that you made a promise, that reason, could be sometimes outweighed by these competing reasons. This is the sense in which that prima facie duty to keep your promise is non-absolute. This is similar to the fact that, look, you might have some reason to go to a party. So the fact that your friends will be there and that you would have fun, that's some reason to go to the party. But there might be stronger reasons, competing reasons for staying home. Maybe you don't feel well. Maybe you haven't gotten very much sleep lately. Maybe you have a test the next day. So maybe even though you have some reason to go to the party, you have stronger competing reasons such that it's the thing you ought to do is maybe stay home. Lastly, to say that it's a prima facie duty is to say that if this reason were the only reason that applied in that situation, then keeping your promise would become the final or all things considered moral duty. So this is the sense in which it's a strong moral reason. The idea is, absent other reasons, if we're just focusing our attention on just this one feature of the action, well, if that's all that mattered in this situation, that would be a strong enough reason to give you a moral obligation to do it. Now, this seems to make sense of why Ross uses the phrases prima facie and duty. It's a prima facie duty in the sense that, so when we're focusing on just this one feature of the action and we're ignoring everything else. So on that first appearance, where the first appearance includes just this one feature of the action, well, that is enough such that it would make the action our duty, the required thing, if that was the only feature of the action. But the reason it's not decisive, the reason that we sometimes aren't required to do it nonetheless, is because when we get a better sort of picture of the action, we sometimes notice that there are other morally relevant features as well. So Ross himself puts forward an initial suggestion of 7 prima facie duties that all provide a distinct foundation for the morality, so morally right and wrong action. Now, Ross wasn't necessarily committed to exactly these 7. What he was really committed to was just this idea that there is a plurality of non-absolute moral rules at the foundation. But he puts forward these 7 so we can at least get a picture of how this would tie into a bigger picture of morality. The first prima facie duty he puts forward is beneficence. See the word root bene? That means good. So this is the duty of enhancing the intelligence, virtue, or pleasure of others. In other words, it's the duty to do good for other people. The duty of self-improvement is the duty to make oneself more intelligent or virtuous, to do good for oneself. The duty of non-maleficence, notice the word root mal stands for bad. This is the duty to prevent harm to others, to prevent bad things from happening. He also thinks there's a duty of fidelity. This is the duty to keep our promise, to be faithful to our word, to tell the truth. He thinks there's a duty of reparations. So this is the duty to repair harm that we have done. So if you do something wrong, you then have an obligation to make up for that fact. There's a duty of gratitude, a duty to appropriately acknowledge the benefits that others have given us, a duty of justice, a duty of ensuring that virtue is rewarded and vice is punished. Now notice, all of these sort of duties can come in degrees. So something might be more or less beneficent. And so depending upon how much good it does, you might have more or less reason to do that. Similarly with, say, reparations. Well, maybe the harm you did to someone else was very small. Maybe you just bumped into them on the sidewalk and they tripped a little. At that point, maybe your duty of reparations, you can meet that just by saying sorry. Or gratitude. Sometimes it's a very small duty. For instance, maybe someone just opens a door for you. At that point, maybe you can meet your duty of gratitude by just saying thank you. But sometimes it might be much more severe. So in the case of reparations, maybe you've done something really, really bad, and so saying sorry isn't going to be enough to make up for it. You got to do more. Or in the case of gratitude, maybe someone didn't just open a door for you. Maybe it's a parent that helped pay your tuition throughout college or helped pay for your rent throughout college. That might require a little bit more than a thank you in order to show that kind of gratitude or the appropriate amount of gratitude. Similarly with justice. Well, how much vice was there? How bad was the thing that they did might change how much punishment they thereby deserve. The other thing I want to point out about these sort of 7 duties of Ross is that all of them are fundamental. So Ross thinks that none of them can be explained by appealing to any of the others. So he says, we have a duty to keep our promises, and that's fundamental. You can't explain our duty to keep why we have a duty to keep our promises by appealing to the fact that we have a duty to do good for others or to prevent harm. He says, merely the fact that something keeps our promise, that by itself is what gives us the sort of moral reason to do that action. Moreover, I want to distinguish some of these duties seem different than the others. We can classify them into 2 groups that explains why Ross's ethic of prima facie duties might be able to capture both the advantages of consequentialism and the advantages of Kantianism. Look at these first three: beneficence, self-improvement, non-maleficent. These all look like sort of consequentialist type moral reasons. They're all what you might call forward-looking duties. They're looking to the future and looking at the results of your action to see what reasons you have to perform them. They're looking at what good results can you get for others or yourself, and what bad results can you prevent. And so it's looking at those results, those future results, for reasons, moral reasons to do one thing or the other. The last four, however, fidelity, reparations, gratitude, and justice, are what we might call backward-looking duties. They're not looking to the results of our actions to find reasons to do one thing rather than another. Rather, they're looking to what has happened in the past to give us guidance about what the right thing to do would be. So the fact that we made a promise in the past is now a reason to do this thing now. The fact that we did something wrong to someone else in the past is a reason now to, say, repair that harm, to do this thing, to say sorry. And the idea is, it's not the consequence. It's not the fact that it makes this person feel good or it helps them avoid a slight to their feelings. It's the fact that you did a harm. That by itself is a reason. We merely had to look to the past sort of feature to have this duty now to perform this action. Similarly with justice. The fact that someone did something right is now a reason to reward them. The fact that someone did something wrong in the past is now a reason to punish them. But now you might sort of wonder, but how do these prima facie duties relate to the right and wrong action? Because remember, a prima facie duty is non-absolute. It might sometimes be okay to break that fundamental prima facie moral rule. So how do we get from the prima facie duties to what is actually the morally right thing to do in a particular situation? Well, here what we're looking for is what you might call your final or all things considered duty. This is the action that you have the strongest moral reasons to do when we've taken account of all factors. So if a single prima facie duty is all that applies to a situation at hand, then the morally right action, your final duty, would just be whatever that prima facie duty tells you to do. But oftentimes, as I said, more than one of these duties might apply in a given situation. And at that point, the morally right action, your final duty, is to follow whichever prima facie duties are sort of on balance stronger or more important in that specific context. So you can think of this as kind of like a scale. So the prima facie duties, so if, say, maybe an action would keep a promise that I made, well, that's one feature of the action that sort of tips the scales a little bit towards that being the right thing to do. But now imagine that by breaking that promise, I could actually help someone sort of do more good in the future. Well, that's some reason to break the promise and sort of tips the scales the other way. And we keep on adding these different prima facie duties on each side of the scale until we've considered all the morally relevant sort of prima facie duties that apply to that situation. Well, whichever of those duties is sort of strongest, sort of tips the scales the farthest, that's the morally right thing to do in that situation. Let's consider a couple examples. We've already seen this case of lying for protection. So a close friend has confided in you that they live with a physically and mentally abusive family member. They tell you that they are leaving their current living situation to live with a close friend. The next day, their family member stops by your place looking for your friend. They ask if you have any information on their whereabouts. You have good evidence that this family member would severely injure your friend if you gave the family member information on your friend's whereabouts. So, what is the morally right thing to do? Well, notice, according to Ross, there are multiple prima facie duties that apply to you. So, your prima facie duty of fidelity means you have some reason to tell the truth here. And that's an important reason that it's still present here. It doesn't go away. But you also have a prima facie duty of non-maleficence, of sort of preventing harm from sort of coming to your friend. And so according to Ross, what you have to do here to figure out what your all things considered duty is, you take all these prima facie duties that might apply to this situation and you try to determine which one is the strongest. And it seems like in this case, the duty of non-maleficence, of preventing harm to your friend, is a stronger reason, a more important reason in this situation, in this context, than your duty to tell the truth. And so, according to Ross, he'd likely say that's the right thing to do here, is to not give the person, sort of tell them about your friend's whereabouts. Or consider the organ harvesting case. 5 patients arrive at the ER at the same time. They're each dying of organ failure. Each needs a different organ. If they don't receive that organ transplant immediately, they will certainly die. The only way to get each person an organ is to harvest the organs of a healthy person in the hallway, who the doctor just happens to know is a universal match. The only things the doctor can do are harvest the healthy person's organs to save the 5, or do nothing and let the 5 die. Well, according to Ross, you have there's a lot of prima facie duties that apply here. First, the doctor has a prima facie duty of beneficence, so to do good for these patients that are in the ER that are suffering organ failure. But they also have a duty of non-maleficence, to not cause harm to the healthy person. They also have a duty of fidelity if they took the Hippocratic Oath. So the fact that they took that Hippocratic Oath when they became a doctor, that's some reason not to harvest the person's organs. Also, the fact that they would be causing harm to the healthy person is a reason not to do it. But the fact that they could do good and save these people's lives is still a reason to sort of harvest the organs and save these 5. And so we have these reasons that are competing with one another. Again, just like the party case I considered earlier, where you have some reason to go to the party, but you also have some reason not to go to the party. In order to figure out what the morally right action is, we need to weigh these reasons against one another. And it seems like in this situation, your sort of prima facie duty of non-maleficence, of not causing harm, and maybe even your duty of sort of fidelity to keep your promise of that sort of Hippocratic Oath, it looks like those reasons are stronger and more important in this scenario, such that they outweigh the sort of beneficence, the prima facie duty of beneficence. I mean, the prima facie duty of beneficence, it doesn't disappear. It's still there in this scenario. It's just that it's outweighed by these competing reasons, and so the right thing to do is to do nothing and let the 5 die. So that's it for this video. Next time we're going to take a closer look at the benefits of the ethic of prima facie duties. See you then. Bye-bye.